So you wrote this book, Lean Agile Acceptance Test-Driven Development, Better Software Through Collaboration. But first of all, I think let's clarify the definition. So what is acceptance test? Because I hear this term being used multiple times, sometimes means differently to different people. So maybe if we can start from there, that would be great.
Okay. So my definition of acceptance test is any test that a system must pass in order to be accepted. That can be provided by the customer, the users, the testers, because the testers still play a big role, or anybody else. And if you can't ship a system without these tests, well, they are the acceptance tests.
Wow, it's very concise. Actually, I was struck by your definition of the test that actually makes the system accepted. I know a lot of people these days, especially maybe in the startups, we have tests, but we just deploy it anyway. What does it take for people to realize that, okay, you really need to have these kind of tests before you can actually accept the system?
You've got a couple of things here. First, if you know what you want the system to do, as opposed to you're just experimenting, and it's hard to create acceptance tests if you're experimenting with a system. It's like you just want to try something out, prototyping it. So we're not going to be writing acceptance tests for those sorts of things because they change all the time. But once you've decided in your experiment that this is what you want the system to do, that writing the acceptance test absolutely clarifies the requirements. You don't get into this issue of, well, should it work for 1,000 or 900? You have a test for it. Either test says 900 or the test says 1,000. By documenting that test, and it's actually then becomes, in the term, executable specification, if you will, means that now our description is the test, as opposed to a set of requirements that, well, that's nice, but what does it mean? How are we sure that we're meeting the requirements? And that misinterpretation of the requirements is probably the biggest thing that goes back and hits people. It's like you get to the end and the testers find a defect. And the developers say, no, the requirement said this. And the tester said, no, the requirement says that. Why didn't you guys agree ahead of time what the requirement said?
I think that's a very important key point, right? Because you mentioned requirements sometimes is misunderstood. Sometimes it's vague as well. And sometimes it's just one-liner. Okay, build me this. You bring a point in your book that you mentioned that testable requirements should have acceptance tests associated with them. So I think this is also a key discipline when you define requirements. You always have to define it in such a way that it is testable. If you can elaborate a little bit more on this point.
Okay, so there's a concept of a testable requirement. How do you know the requirement is testable? By writing a test for it. If you cannot write a test for a requirement, then the requirement is untestable. If a requirement is untestable, how do you know the system is doing it? Why are you asking for the requirement if there's no way we can tell this system is actually performing that behavior?
Yeah, that is actually true. If you define a requirement in one liner, but then leave other people to test, if at the end you think the software is not acceptable, I mean, at the end, it's your fault as well, right? So you don't actually specify the requirement that can be tested in a way. There's a point where you mentioned that acceptance tests, if done properly, can be an authoritative and reliable source of what the software should do functionally. So I think especially we mentioned about executable specifications, if everything even is defined by using tests, I think that's a good way of getting the reliable source of truth about all the requirements that the software does. So we know about the definition. I think some people also know about the benefits, but can you elaborate what are the benefits of acceptance tests?
Okay. So the main benefit, it's always based in your context. If I go into someplace and I ask them, so how many times does something come back from the testing environment or from production back to development with a defect? And if the answer is 0.01%, I'm going to go, well, there's not much I can do for you. I mean, we can spend some time, but you're pretty good. If the answer is 1%, I'm going, well, how much time does it take you to solve the defect? If it's started to creep any more than that, there are places that are. I call them a loop back. A loop back is when you send something out and it gets sent back with a defect that you should have thought about before, as opposed to feedback, which is you send something out and you learn something new to help improve the product. If you can cut your loopback rate down dramatically, then you can flow that business value through your developmental value stream much quicker and get things out so that you're actually always working on new stuff as opposed to fixing defects. And in fact, that's the way I usually sell it to developers. I go, hey, guess what? You're getting your requirements in a testable form. Your job is to write an implementation that passes those tests. Now, you'll still maybe have some communication and collaboration because maybe the tests aren't quite clear and so forth. But once you pass the test, you're done. If we are able to describe as much as possible requirements and tests that would have normally been done in a post-implementation phase, that means that you won't have any defects to fix. Do you like fixing defects? Do you spend your life just going, oh man, I just want another defect I can fix today? So that's how I sell it to a development team.
Well, some people with wrong incentives might like fixing defects because some people are incentivized by number of defects found. But I mean, joke aside, I think I get your point that if we can reduce the number of loopback or rework or something that goes back from your value stream, right, from the last back to the beginning again, I think that can cut down a lot of inefficiency.